Yes, there is a lot of good stuff going on at the University of Louisville, and this is the show that you hear all about it. This is UofL Today with Mark Hebert on Talk Radio 1080 WKJK and iHeartMedia. Thanks for joining us for this program where we talk to researchers and students, alumni, and others about the great stuff going on at UofL. On the show today, he's a UofL professor who spends his spare time under the sea studying lost civilizations and sunken ships. We'll talk to John Hale about his latest adventure. And you've seen the stories about Kentucky's child abuse crisis. We'll hear from a UofL researcher who worked on a major project charting child abuse and who is most likely to abuse a kid. But first, she's the only female urologist in Louisville focusing on incontinence and reconstructive surgeries. Kellen Choi is with UofL Physicians. She's also an assistant professor of urology in the UofL School of Medicine. Well, welcome, Kellen. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me today.
And I welcomed you to Louisville because you're fairly new to Louisville, right?
Yeah, fairly new. We joined last year. My husband is also faculty here, so we've been blessed to be in Louisville.
Okay. Where'd you come from?
I moved from Houston, Texas,
Okay.
but I did all my training and for residency in Charleston, West Virginia, and moved up to Minnesota for a reconstructive fellowship.
So you've been all over the United States here,
All
haven't
over
you?
the place, yeah.
Okay.
And then now, when it was time to settle down, we both were familiar with Louisville, where my husband trained.
Oh, okay.
So we decided to join.
So that's how you got back to, and now
Yes.
you're with UofL Physicians,
Correct,
right?
yes.
So that's how people can track you down.
Yeah,
if they're looking
absolutely.
for a urologist,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Okay, so it's UofL Physicians. All right, well, let's talk about a little about what you do.
Sure.
What's your job?
Yeah, so as a urologist, I see patients, I obviously do general urology where, a lot of people wonder, what do urologists do? So we take care of all the urinary system, medically and surgically. So say you have a kidney stone and you come to our office, I'm happy to take care of that. But also if you come to my office telling me, hey, doc, I just can't pee like I used to, or some people say I'm peeing all the time, I really try to boil it down. Is there any medical or surgical reason for that? So, it just covers a lot of different
stuff.
things. Yeah.
And one of the big things I think is incontinence, isn't it?
Right.
Especially in older folks like
Yeah.
me. I don't have it, but
Yeah, so funny that you say, because when I was a student, and then you have to go through a match, and then when you find out you match to urology residency, one of the ER emergency room attending I was rotating at was like, why do you want to be a urologist? Because predominantly urology is more like a boys club where a lot of male dominating field. But I said, there's something at that time, it was with limited knowledge I had a student. I was like, there's something so therapeutic about, or rewarding rather, about helping men who wants to pee, and the ladies who don't want to pee, not pee. So that was my idea, and everybody laughed. But as I did my training, 5 years of residency and then a year of reconstructive urology, I realized it's so much more. There is men who don't want to pee, but they pee a lot, whether that's overactive bladder, or women who wants to pee, but they may have diabetes, or they had like a spinal cord injury from accident or gunshot, whatever the trauma was, and they're not able to pee. So there's so many variety of urologic condition. So I always say, in your lifetime, you're bound to see a urologist at least once.
yeah, you probably are. And you are the only female in Louisville, right? Only female urologist in Louisville.
So we're
this really is a boys' club, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's throughout the country too. Currently, a board certified practicing urologist, as a woman gender, we only make 9%.
Wow.
That being said, residency, where they're getting trained to be a urologist of this, future generation, I believe latest statistics say 25% of residents are currently women. So
more and more women are
more
getting
and more,
into the urology
but we just have to
field.
wait a little longer. But yeah, I see a variety of patient population. Right now, I see about half men and women patients.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking with Kellen Choi, who's with UofL Physicians, and she's an assistant professor of urology in the UofL School of Medicine and treats patients with UofL Physicians. So what is the most common thing that people come to your urologist with?
So,
is it incontinence?
Surprisingly, yes. Since I tailor my practice towards a lot of complex voiding dysfunction, I get a lot of referrals from family physicians, or even within my group. A lot of my colleagues in my urology group do a lot of different men's health or cancer. So I see a lot of cancer survivors. They may have incontinence, or ladies, we go through childbirth, right? So after having 1-2 babies, just having babies or carrying a baby during pregnancy can put you at higher risk for different type of incontinence. Or, as we all get older, no one's getting younger, right? As we get older, a lot of patients get up and late at night because they have to urinate. Or for men, it could be large prostate.
Hey, it's once a night, every night for me.
Well, once a night is actually not too bad.
That's okay? All right,
I've heard worse. So, yes, a lot of patients come to me. And the thing about the whole umbrella term of avoiding dysfunction is that it could be anything. Typically patients, should be able to hold their urine, and go to bathroom every 3 hours. But I always ask, if you cannot even sit through a movie, unless movie is like 4 hour long,
Right.
But if you watch like an hour, 2 hour movie and you have to go out during the movie, maybe you're having some kind of overactive symptom.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any easy things you can tell
Yeah,
folks
absolutely.
about here's how to cure it?
Yeah, so when I first see my patients in my office, whether it's men or women, or even teenagers or who's about to go off to college, I see quite a few of those patients. I always try to do conservative things as opposed to jumping into surgery. Although I'm a surgeon, I love to operate, but I want to make sure I'm doing conservative. So one of the really easy thing you can do, it sounds silly, but there's something avoiding diary, where you kind of write, like, dear diary, this is how
How many times I peed today?
Yeah, it really is. So 24-hour track of how much you drank, what you drank, and what was the trigger to make you to have a strong urge or have incontinence, and document it throughout the day. So I usually have them do on weekend. I give them a little hat with a measuring cup, so every time they go to the bathroom, they can document. And that can really give me information. Some patient, I found out that all they ever drink is soda or whiskey all day long. And
Or whiskey?
Yeah, whiskey too. So they're
Well, that's not good.
I know, and then that can be diuretic
that's a whole
too.
other problem.
That's another thing. So I'm not gonna touch
Yeah.
on that today. But just writing down your habit of what you're drinking, what are your triggers, can really help you out. So I start there, and then if that's not enough, I make sure there's no other medical reasons. Make sure they're emptying their bladder properly. If there is any concerning things like previous family history of cancer, or they're seeing blood in urine, I can do a quick procedure in my office called cystoscopy to look inside the bladder. So I try to make sure I'm not missing anything prior to having a specific treatment plan. Yeah.
I'm talking with Kellen Choi, who's the only female urologist in the Louisville area. She's with the University of Louisville Physicians and also teaches at the UofL School of Medicine. What do you tell folks who say, well, my other doctor's telling me to drink, 8 glasses of water a day and all the, gallons of water
Yeah.
because it's good for me, but
Yeah.
here you're telling me, well, wait a minute, that might force you to cause you to pee too many times a
Well,
day.
that's a really good point. Drinking water is really important, and it is helpful, especially in the summertime. It can prevent getting kidney stones, and it is overall good. But what I try to tell my patient is, if there is certain things that makes you, certain like beverages or a lot of coffee or certain things that make it worse, then I try to have them be, mindful of that. But just drinking water itself is excellent habit.
Okay, so keep doing that.
Keep doing it, but not too crazy amount. Moderation is key. Yeah.
So what are some of the serious causes of urinary problems?
Yeah, I touch upon it a little bit, but I try to get a good history to see, is there anybody in the family had any kind of urinary cancers? If they're a long-time smoker, a lot of my patients get shocked that smoking could cause kidney and bladder cancer too, because we think about lung cancer when we think of smoking. But if you have a long-time smoking history and you have overactive bladder symptoms, I'm a little more careful to rule out there's nothing else going on, like bladder tumor and things like that. So that could be more serious. For women who had a lot of childbirth, sometimes you'll hear patients be like, their bladder's dropping because their
Right.
pelvic
Yeah, I've heard
muscle
that, right.
it gets really weak. It's just it's like any other muscle. You keep using it can get weak. So I make sure I do a thorough exam, including pelvic exam, to make sure their bladder or their uterus is not dropping.
Right, and
So-
you can do surgery to
yeah,
correct that, right?
Absolutely. So, as a urologist, we get training in minimally invasive surgery as well as a big open surgery. So, I did a residency as well as fellowship to learn how to do minimally invasive robotic surgery. So I do something called robotic abdominal sacrocolpopexy, which is it's
a big long word.
big word. What it is using a minimally invasive technique using a robot to tack those dropped organs through the abdominal area, so their anatomy is restored.
All right, how can folks get a hold of you?
So I am in University of Louisville ULP Physicians Group. So if you just type Kellen Choi, it should be easily come out, and I'm happy to see anybody who may need my assistance.
Okay, that's Choi, Choi. Kellen's the first name, just like it sounds. All right.
Yes.
Kellen, again, welcome to Louisville. Welcome to the University of
Thank
Louisville.
you.
I'm glad you're here. Well, this man in front of me has a really fascinating life. He teaches at UofL, spends his free time exploring shipwrecks and lost civilizations. John Hale's an archaeologist. He's also the head of the Liberal Studies program at the University of Louisville. He's here to talk about his research in general and also some Mayan ruins in a lake in Central America. John, good to see you.
Good to be with you.
Always good to see you. So, are you the most fascinating man in America?
I think I've got the most fascinating job. I don't know whether I live up to it or not, but the job is interesting.
The job is really interesting. All right. Well, let's just talk about, in general, just some of the stuff that you do. You're an archaeologist, but you do a lot of scuba diving.
I do. I've always loved water. Mom and Dad, I'm one of 7 kids, and we were all pitched into pools when we were 3 and 4, and joined New Albany Country Club swimming team when we were in the 5 and under bracket. And so I've always loved water, and became interested in ships when I was getting into ancient history and archaeology in high school and college. Up at Yale, started studying ancient Greek ships. I was a rower on the Yale crew, and I was interested in all those ancient galleys that were pulled by oars, not by slaves, as Ben-Hur shows it, but by citizens who wanted to power their city to naval dominance. So all those ships were of great interest to me, and it became kind of a holy grail to help find some of those ancient ships that had been sunk in big sea battles, like the Battle of Salamis, where Persians tried to take over Europe, but the Athenian fleet stopped them off Athens near the island of Salamis. Other great naval confrontations like that. So getting underwater and trying to find the shipwrecks was a big deal to me.
And so you're still doing it, and you've been over in Europe. You've been, Mediterranean?
Mediterranean.
And some other places.
And most recently I've been working in a harbor on the coast of Israel. Israel doesn't have any natural harbors, but Caesar Augustus constructed one out of Roman concrete for his friend King Herod the Great. And since then, Israel's had a wonderful artificial Roman harbor reaching a third of a mile out into the sea, 2 big enclosed harbors. Well, they're full of old shipwrecks because as tsunamis cracked the harbor walls, ships had to thread their way through to get into the inner harbor. And most recently, we've worked on a Arab wreck of 1,000 years ago, where the Arabs were sending shipments of gold to rebuild Jerusalem, their city, after an earthquake. They were sending it up from Egypt. One of those treasure ships sank getting into that harbor. Must have sunk at night because nobody dived down through the 90 feet of water and salvaged anything. So bags of these, now the bags have rotted, but we've got these thousands of gold Arab dinars minted at the Cairo Mint. Cairo was created to be a mint city. It was
Really?
a special little place. They brought all the camel caravans with the gold from Arabia, from North Africa, and turned them into these coins to fund these Egyptian ventures.
We're talking with John Hale, who's an archaeologist and the head of the Liberal Studies program at the University of Louisville. We're talking about his adventures in seas and oceans and lakes across the world and what he's diving for. So when you say you go underwater and you work on these projects, what do? Are you salvaging gold? Are you mapping what's going on under there? Are you looking at the ships? What are you doing?
Starts with mapping and documentation. You've got to, in archaeology, I'm so glad we have crime scene investigation television series now, because people get it now. We're like those CSI teams or NCIS. We go to a place where something happened in the past. Often it involves deaths, but it's not always a crime. But we try to collect all the physical clues that are there. The historians may or may not have written down something about it, but historians' records are always incomplete, slanted, focused on headline-grabbing stuff. We're interested in the natural setting, the ordinary lives of people who were involved. How does this relate to economies and things like that? So we will go to a place and where something happened, and we'll collect every possible clue. And where it's a shipwreck, that means you've got a time capsule, where a big ship, which was probably the most elaborate single technological item of that world, went down. So the ship itself is important. And then its ballast stones that make it sail right, those have been laded at the last port so we can tell where its previous port of call was. And then the cargo itself, the remains of the crew, all of their belongings. It is just an extraordinary time capsule of a whole world.
So you just dive down and look at that stuff. All right, well, let's talk about Lake. Is it Atitlan? Is that how you say it?
Atitlan, that's right.
Atitlan, and that is where?
It's in Guatemala. It's a gigantic volcanic crater, a mile high, looking out over the Pacific. And it was described by Aldous Huxley as the most beautiful lake in the world, and I agree with him. It's a crater lake, so it's a perfect circle, high cliffs around most of the sides, and beautiful soaring snow-capped mountains. The active volcano still coming up around its edge. So there's nothing like Lake
And this is in
Atitlan.
Guatemala.
Guatemala.
And what did folks discover there, and what are you doing there?
What was discovered was a sport diver, the first guy to get scuba gear just a few years back in Lake Atitlan. It's a deep lake and it's cold, and diving's not that popular in it. But he went down, and he suddenly found himself at about 90 feet down looking at stone walls on the floor of the lake, and what looked like old pathways and maybe even altars. So he came back up and sputtered and got excited and dived a few more times, brought up pottery that showed it was a Maya site about 1,000 years old. So this is before Europeans would have gotten over to this side of the Atlantic. And they had a little circular island out in the middle of that lake, which has since been drowned by the rise of the water level. But then it was a little pilgrimage island, and they would come out in their canoes from all sides of the lake, different tribes coming. They'd leave beautiful offerings of pots and gifts to the gods, and they constructed these altars, standing stones to represent the gods, special pathways for the pilgrims, docks around the edges of the island, and the docks showed us what the water level was then, because the dock was right at water level. So it was just one of the most fascinating projects I've ever done to kind of recover an entire world that had been lost to sight for a millennium.
And it had been there forever and ever.
Well,
since
about 10
Mayan
centuries,
times, yeah. And so, again, is that what you did? You mapped the site?
Yes, we mapped it. It was real tough to do because the visibility was not good. And ultimately, we used remote sensing, satellite images that could see down through the water. I was helped by my colleague Robert Forbes here in Geography Geosciences to work with these satellites, get all these data that could see down through the water, give the exact contours of the island. And then we did stuff called swath bathymetry and side scan sonar, going back and forth over the island in a research vessel, which it's like you're mowing a lawn. You do strip after strip after strip. On each strip, you're doing these sonar takes that give you every bump on the bottom, every elevation. And when you merge all those very complex files, and as I said, my colleague Robert Forbes helped with that, bing, out come these exact maps, three-dimensional, showing every contour of the coastline, all the bumps that are the ancient constructions, and it was really fascinating to turn those into modern maps.
Again, John Hale, archaeologist, head of the Liberal Studies program at UofL, who goes around the world scuba diving, basically, and looking at lost civilizations. What's the most interesting place you've been in underwater?
That's a tough one because they're all so fascinating. I guess for me the most interesting one was most interesting day was I've always been interested in the ancient Greeks since I was a little kid, and the Greek and Persian wars were a time when the Greeks got out to sea and faced the Persians at these epic sea battles and really won the war at sea. And so I designed a project that a lot of my fellow scholars from around the world got on board with, and Greece and Turkey got on board with, to visit every single ancient sea battle site, to go there with a research vessel, dive down, see what we could find. And there was a place that wasn't a battle. It was a place where King Xerxes of Persia was sending his armada of 1,000 ships past this dangerous promontory of northern Greece up in the northern Aegean called Mount Athos. It's famous today as a monastery where these monks have kept up a 1,500-year tradition of living in this isolated life on top of this cliff. They came out and waved to us. And so we were diving down there at the site of this Persian war catastrophe, and we actually found weaponry from those Persian soldiers whose ships had been smashed. They had sunk and drowned there. Persians never learned to swim. They weren't like Greeks. So it was a terrible disaster for King Xerxes of Persia. And to get some of those actual bronze weapons that were headed for Greece, and if they'd made it, might have made a huge difference to the whole outcome of European freedom. That was a very exciting dive.
Last question, make it quick because we only got a couple seconds here left. But sometimes you take students on these trips with you. So is that an opportunity for a student who comes to the University of Louisville and they like to scuba dive? They might, and they study geography or something
Absolutely. Anybody who's interested, coming into college and interested in history and geography and in the ancient world, scuba diving is a great skill. It's a wonderful life skill in any case, but it can often apply to any kind of research.
All right, John Hale, always great to talk to you. Always really interesting stuff. When a child comes into an emergency room with signs of child abuse, new research gives us a pretty good idea of who the adult abuser might be. Doug Lorenz is an associate professor of biostatistics at the UofL School of Public Health and Information Sciences, and he played a role in that study, and he's here to talk about it. Doug, always good to see you.
Good to see you too, Mark.
Welcome back to the show.
Thank you much.
All right, so you were part of a big study on child abuse, particularly kids that come into the emergency room.
That's correct. The primary focus of the study was to look at bruising profiles in children that present to the emergency department. And the primary goal was to see if those bruising profiles could be discriminatory for abuse versus accidental injuries. But in that process, they measured a whole host of other characteristics of the children, of caregiving arrangements, of psychosocial risk factors. And the idea behind all of our subsequent publications from this study is that we're looking for any kind of ammunition where we can identify kids that have been abused.
So was this really, I'm not going to call it the first huge study of child abuse cases that come into the emergency room, but this was a really big study. It involved a lot of people, a lot of kids, right?
Yes. I think over 2,000 kids were participants in the study. This data set's a little bit limited because sometimes information was difficult to collect, but this is the first large-scale study in a pediatric emergency department.
And we ought to point out, too, and we ought to be clear that these were only children that were brought into the emergency rooms, right? These statistics you're about to spout here are not for child abuse cases as a whole, right?
Yes, and that even narrows down a little bit further. It's not just kids that presented to the emergency department. They also, in order to participate in the study, had to have signs of bruising on a skin exam.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk about that. So what were the big findings from your point of view on this study in terms of who is doing the abusing of these kids? And they were kids under 4.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So we were trying to identify if any of the features of the caregiving arrangement of the child were discriminatory for abuse versus accidental injuries. We looked at the gender of the caregiver, the relationship of the caregiver to the child, whether or not the caregiver was alone or with other caregivers at the time, and then as two other sort of side goals, we looked to see if the caregiving arrangement at the time of injury was different than normal, and we also looked at if the caregiver happened to be in a relationship, how long that relationship had lasted.
Mm-hmm. And out of those cases, who did you find is the most likely to abuse a kid?
The most likely to abuse a kid, we can't technically make that attribution that they actually abused the kid because we only know that they were present at the time of injury.
Okay.
The most likely abusers were, by gender, were men. And in that category of men, we found that fathers and boyfriends of the mother of the child were most likely to abuse. And the statistics for the boyfriends were alarmingly high. There were 106 cases in which the boyfriend was present at the time of the injury. And out of those 106, 100 times the diagnosis was abuse.
So meaning what? So
95% of the time that a kid comes to the ER with a bruise and was watched by the boyfriend, the diagnosis was abuse.
It was abuse. It wasn't just a bruise that happened. The other 6 cases were kid fell down the steps, hit his head on something.
And we saw higher levels of abuse with a lot of the different male caregivers, but for the mother's boyfriend in particular, that was alarmingly high.
So that tells doctors, police, others what? What does it say?
It's a question that they need to ask. All of these things are largely targeted towards physicians. The information that they can gather when they see a child with a bruise, and we are sort of adding to the host of questions that they may ask when the child presents to the ED. Who was taking care of the child is extremely critical.
We're talking to Doug Lorenz, an associate professor of biostatistics in the UofL School of Public Health and Information Sciences at the University of Louisville. We're talking about a child abuse study that he worked on with several others at other universities in the past year or so, I guess it was.
That's correct.
What did you learn about the well, I'm not going to call it obvious. That's a misnomer. What did you learn about what appears to be child abuse when in the care of a mother or that the mother is alone? What did you learn?
Well, we learned that because society is still somewhat matriarchal, that the mother was most commonly present when an injury occurred. And we learned that, but what we did learn was that the rate of abuse when the mother was the caregiver was much, much lower. And then when we looked at things, drilled down a little bit deeper, when we separated out cases in which the mother was alone versus when the mother was with another caregiver, we found that there was a protective effect when the mother was alone. Abuse rates dropped even lower when the mother was by herself, and that applied for most female caregivers as well. And then when we looked at the situations where the mother was with another caregiver, abuse rates were a little bit elevated. And it turned out more often than not that the other caregiver's present happened to be male.
Okay. So the bottom line is if there's a female around, particularly the mother with a little kid, the chances of that kid getting abused is less.
Yes, absolutely. And it's important to speak I guess, proportionally. The most common caregiver present in cases of abuse was the mother, but that's just by the fact that the mother was most commonly present.
Right.
After you adjust out all of these other factors, whether other males were there and how often the mother was there, the rates, again, were protective. They were much lower.
And now we're talking about a female caregiver, though, but you did find something about babysitters or caregivers that were not the mom, right? What'd you find out about that?
Female babysitters and girlfriends of fathers. We didn't have a large sample for those, but what we did find was that rates of abuse were elevated. And we sort of chalked that up to as sort of the same effect for male boyfriends and male babysitters. When they're not related to the child, abuse seems a little bit more likely.
So if parents come home and they find a bruise on their kid and somebody has been a babysitter with them, what should they assume? Or should they not assume anything?
They shouldn't assume anything. A lot of our forthcoming research is about, where the bruise is, because some bruises happen. Kids get shin bruises.
Yeah, my kids did. There were a couple times we were afraid to go to the pediatrician because we were going, my kid's got a bad black eye here.
When I take
mom and dad are abusing the kid.
When I take my kids to the doctor, if they looked at their shins, it would look like a war zone.
Exactly.
But if the bruise is in a more suspicious area, some of the regions that we've targeted, like the neck, the ears, along the line of the jaw and the cheek, there are suspicious areas where are bruises that in certain areas that are suspicious for abuse. And if you've noticed one, and say you have a new babysitter or a babysitter that, say has a stressful life of their own, then maybe you want to ask questions of your child.
Right. Again, we're talking to Doug Lorenz, who's an associate professor of biostatistics in the UofL School of Public Health and Information Sciences. We got about a minute or so left here, Doug. So what do you want to learn out of this study? What do you want doctors to know from this study?
Primarily, if there is a host of questions that they're asking a child in whom they're suspicious of abuse, questions about who is watching the child are of paramount importance. Because we found such discriminatory findings for male caregivers and specifically for the male boyfriends, it's something that can help make that diagnosis. If there's already a pre-existing suspicion, then you need to know who is watching the child.
Okay. And you said also that you're going to take this study a little bit further, or there are some future studies. What are those, and what are you going to tackle in those?
Well, we measured psychosocial risk factors. The presence of intimate partner violence in the family, whether there's a criminal history in any of the caregivers. That paper's forthcoming soon. We found that to be highly discriminatory for abuse. And then the main paper to come out of this entire study is how the bruising profile in the body, which regions of the body may happen to be predictive of abuse. That one's coming very soon as well.
Okay, well, that'll be interesting to hear about that one.
Yeah, I'll be here if you want me to.
I'm sure you will be. All right, Doug, always good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Mark.
Appreciate you being on the show. All right, that'll about do it for this edition of UofL Today with Mark Hebert, which you can hear every Monday night at 6 on Talk Radio 1080 WKJK and iHeartMedia. You can also listen to the podcast of the shows on SoundCloud or watch the programs on Metro TV and KETKY throughout the week or on UofL's YouTube channel anytime. Check out all the UofL news, videos, and events at UofLnews.com. Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards!